generation yet unborn, and they take that responsibility very seriously.
And in a sense, the one that is not chosen by a woman has accountability then to all the women.
To all the women. Yes, yes,
That as a
and to me.
And to you. and one of the things that you know, it's boy, for a white woman, it's a little hard to get my mind around this. Amazing, as it was for the suffragists, when they saw imperfectly. You know, these are women who have no right to their bodies. They had no right to their children. A husband could will away an unborn child, and that child would be given to its rightful owner when the child was born. Had no right to your own property. Anything that you earned became your husband's. Women were considered dead in the law once they married, had no legal existence. So, living in that kind of a world, husbands had the right to rape their wives. Marital rape wasn't outlawed until the 1970s with the second wave of feminism. And there are still some states in which, under some conditions, men have the right to rape their wives. Husbands had the right to beat their wives as long as they did it without inflicting permanent damage. Now think about, you are a woman, a white woman at that time, and you meet up with someone like Betty, one of her ancestors, and you are going to have your mind blown. And no, you are going to see a world that you were told was not possible. Religiously, you are told that you are to be under the authority of men. Biologically, you're told that you're the clinging vine to the mighty oak. Well, you meet some mighty oaks and you launch a women's rights movement. And my thought is, and I don't expect anybody to accept anything that I say, but if you will look at the book, the anthology, it begins with the suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Alice Fletcher, as they are inspired by Native women. One quick story. Alice Fletcher, at the International Council of Women in 1888. This is the first time that women gather on United States soil to talk about their rights, women from all over the Western world. They listen to Alice Fletcher talking about her interaction with Native women, and she tells us a story. One of the stories that she tells is, now, sitting with a group of Native women, these are Omaha women in the Midwest, and one of the women gave away a horse, and I, without thinking, said, hadn't you better check with your husband? And she said, the merriment with which my words were met. You know, it's kind of like, what planet did this woman come from? You know, they're just laughing their heads off. And then she goes on to say that the women that she's talked to and the men, and one of the men that she cites is Sitting Bull. I was able to figure out that's who she was talking to. And Sitting Bull said to Alice Fletcher, this suffragist, he was worried that when his women, the women, Native women, came under United States law, they would suffer even more than the men, because they would lose their rights as Indians, but they would lose their position as women. They knew what was going on.
Okay, I'm gonna take a quick moment. Sharon is here. Come on up, Sharon. We'll swap out. So, my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Sharon Nelson, who is the founder and CEO of Crew Civically Reengaged Women, who we are partnering on. And to keep the cadence, I'm just gonna turn it right over back to the panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Dean Peterson. I apologize, and let's go on. Julie, I know that you have done amazing work in the women's adding voice to the women's rights movements and championing things like equal pay and all of these things. What do you think when you read Sally's book and you really have a past connection to why things are staying the same? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very complicated. So my work is primarily as a legal scholar rather than as an activist, and I've been interested in women in constitution making, which is both transgenerational and transnational. And it's transgenerational in that the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibited the denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of sex, is really ratified in 1920. And many of the suffragists that take up most of Sally's book actually began the movement around the time as abolitionists, around the time of even before the Civil War. So many of the suffragists actually did not live, like Susan B. Anthony did not live to see the 19th Amendment ratified. But at the same time, these writings give meaning to what we understand the 19th Amendment to be about. And what's so interesting is that some of the things that Sally began to mention in this conversation about women's lack of legal status before the 19th Amendment. Although it's interesting, as a legal matter, it's not the 19th Amendment that changes it, but changes in both judicial interpretation of existing law and legislative change that happens even before the 19th Amendment is actually passed and ratified. And I'm talking about all the ways in which women actually had no independent legal status, independent of their husbands if they were married. So if they worked, often they would be discriminated against and not able to work, but even if they were able to work, the husband would own their earnings. And women did not have equal guardianship over their own children. And so in many other respects, women really had no legal status independently of their husbands, and they certainly didn't have the right to vote. And so the struggle we often group with the suffrage movement dating to the 19th century is actually not really a struggle that's just about the vote. The vote becomes a symbolic entry point for everything else that's wrong with women's subordination and women's lack of legal status before we get to the 19th Amendment. And what's very interesting is that the 19th Amendment is an amendment that really only refers to voting rights. It does not refer to equal rights as a general matter. And so much of my work actually focuses on the struggle for equal rights, which is born out of the 19th Amendment, because it's right after the 19th Amendment is ratified in 1920, and there are a lot of fights involving litigation as to whether or not the 19th Amendment is actually a valid amendment. And there's a bunch of interesting cases in the early 1920s about that before the Supreme Court. But right after the 19th Amendment is ratified, and then women have the vote. Part of the reason women wanted the right to vote was not simply to be able to vote, but to be able to have a voice in changing the laws that gave them no legal status. And so once the 19th Amendment is ratified, Alice Paul, who is probably the most active and significant suffragist by the time that the 19th Amendment is ratified, introduces the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1923. And the Equal Rights Amendment was designed to remove all remaining barriers to women's equality of rights as citizens. Which is to say, any time that the law makes a distinction or treats men and women differently, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was supposed to be kind of the twin of the 19th Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment was meant to fully guarantee women's equal citizenship. And what happens with the Equal Rights Amendment, and just getting us to today, is that there are fights about, and not fights just between the anti-suffragists and the suffragists. The suffrage movement actually splits in the 1920s over the Equal Rights Amendment, because prior to this time, there had been laws that actually protected women in the workplace. So there were laws that protected women from certain dangerous jobs. There were laws that were maximum hour jobs recognizing women's role in reproduction. And many social reformers believed that we needed to have those laws to protect women, but the Equal Rights Amendment was widely understood, and certainly by Alice Paul, the most significant person in the suffrage movement up until this time. It's understood that you can't protect women because they're women or because they're mothers consistent with the vision of sex equality that's advanced in the ERA. And this is a struggle that continues to today. When the ERA was finally adopted by Congress in 1972, it didn't get ratified by the requisite number of states. It came 3 states short because Phyllis Schlafly and other women on the right claimed that if you had equal rights for women, it would actually be bad for women. It would take away all these protections that wives and mothers needed. And this.
Let me just sort of jump in. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but there's some very good points that you brought up, and I don't want us to lose that flavor as we go along, and also to incorporate Dr. Wagner into this thing. When Alice Paul in 1923 in front of that Presbyterian church, and she had this epiphany of an idea. I wonder what Matilda Jocelyn Cage felt about this stuff, and I want to turn it over to Sally to just sort of talk a little bit about where suffrage meets ERA meets all the cacophony of voices in the movement.
Well, what Matilda Jocelyn Cage thought about it, we'd probably have to decide what happens in the afterlife. I think but we can look at what she said during the time. In 1862, she was asked to give the flag presentation speech to send the boys from Fayetteville off to war. And she said, there will be no permanent peace until there is absolute equality for every group. Women and men, blacks and whites, native-born and immigrants, rich and poor. And sometimes I speculate about whether the Civil War has ended, given that definition. But I want to speak for a minute to Julie's. I feel like I'm in between two things that are very, very connected.
They are.
Because I just read a summary, thank you, Julie, of that brilliant paper that you've done, looking at that difference between the equality suffragists and the social suffragists, and the need to implement parenthood into an equal rights thinking. And I think that, when we think just in terms of equality, we miss the knowledge that we could learn from Native women. But I wonder if you might say just a little bit more about how can that be, that looking at parenthood, other countries, as you write in your paper, do it. And how can that be incorporated, which you do so well in your paper?
Well, I always say that were women citizens, or were women included in the term citizen at the founding when the U.S. Constitution was adopted? Were they included in the term citizen after the Civil War, when the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, was adopted? And the Supreme Court, after the Civil War, in Minor versus Happersett, says, yes, women are actually citizens, but voting is not a privilege of citizenship, right? So that's how the law kind of goes. But I actually think the exclusion of women from the vote and other public rights at the founding is not an accident. You can think it's an accident. I mean, legend has it that Abigail Adams said to her husband, don't forget the ladies. And did they forget the ladies when they wrote the Constitution? And they did not actually forget the ladies. The exclusion of women from rights is actually quite deliberate. And I think but we shouldn't regard the deliberate nature of excluding women as an act of hatred. It's actually the framework that existed at the time for raising the next generation, right? There's a legal status, which is the family, right? The family involves a married couple with children, and only one person in that married couple can represent the family in the public sphere, have voting rights, because the other person is going to be very busy raising the children and keeping the home. And this is our legal institutions, including the Constitution, are built on the assumption that that's how a nation gets reproduced, right? Somebody has to raise the children, and if that person is in Congress voting, right? And these are the debates that are actually going on. If you look at the history of the 19th Amendment around the time of ratification. So I think it's not an accident that women are left out. They're left out because this was the arrangement for how a nation is reproduced over time. And a constitution is a document that's supposed to make sure that a polity survives beyond the people who draft it initially, right? Our institutions have been around longer than we have, and will continue to be around after we die. And so if you think of it that way, then of course, once you shift from inequality, exclusion of women, to inclusion of women, and not just inclusion, but full equality, it does mean that full equality has to have a new plan. How are people going to get raised? Because if you're no longer assuming that women with subordinate status are going to stay home and raise the children, you have to have not just full equality, like that's what the law says, but you actually have to start building your institutions around the assumption that everybody who participates in the public sphere is equal, and is equal not only in the public sphere, but also at home. So my understanding of what it means to have equal rights, or even the suffrage, based on the debates that took place at the time, is that you can't just have the equal right to vote. You actually have to have a whole set of institutions that support equal parenting and a 21st century understanding of how a new generation of citizens gets raised.
You have to understand, too, that America, compared to the contemporary countries, is a fairly young country. We're a nation of immigrants, and everybody that founded this country, in a way, was running away from something that they had at home. So
we're a young country, but we have the oldest constitution.
Right. But my point is about the whole circle of life thing coming through.
Yeah, actually, no, you're not the longest living democracy.
No, I mean a constitution.
The Constitution,
in terms of the written document,
right.
setting out the political institutions.
So on the shores of Onondaga Lake, which is only about 4.5 hours north of here, was the birthplace of democracy. It's where they brought our 5 warring nations at the time together under a great law of peace, giving us all responsibilities, right? And responsibilities to Mother Earth, and the responsibilities of men, the responsibilities of women. And that's the balance, right? The natural world, male, female, there's a balance there. So I would say, and I understand what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that democracy didn't even happen in the United States until everybody got the right to vote. You know, until then it was, so it hasn't been that long. And it was Obama, I think, just a couple of, was it 2012, he said on the floor of the UN that the US was the longest living democracy. And my uncle said, not so fast. He's 89 today, and he said not until, everyone was given that equal right. And I think it's so important to think about, where it went off the rails. It went off the rails because women weren't included from the beginning, and they left out the voice of Mother Nature. And we always say, my Aunt Tanya Ganella Fritchner is no longer with us, and my Aunt Nan, her sister, is here with us today. She would always say, Mother Earth is a relative, not a resource. And although it seems that those things are separate, right? They're not, they're very much connected. And I think that that's where the problems lie.
Well, our country, as we all know, is famous for borrowing things conveniently. So, when we came, my point of being a nation of immigrants, when we came and we found the indigenous people here, we learned from the indigenous people, and there are things that are omitted in history which really Dr. Wagner just brilliantly brings out in her melding of the voices in the women's suffrage movement. I urge everybody, it's an incredible read, to check it out when you have a chance. And because Dr. Wagner has told the truth in so many ways, this is a very controversial thing that we're talking about, that we are setting up here, because what happens, and everybody has seen the New York Times articles, and everybody has seen the various people chiming in, suffrage had no space for Black women, There was no mention of that. There hasn't been as much a clamor about Native American women, but really, I was delighted and excited about moderating this thing because we do have a chance at the truth here. And I would love for Dr. Wagner to just sort of give us a little bit of a feeling of that.
You know, if I could, sure. If you'd allow me to, I think if we look at different phases of the movement, that we can get a clearer sense of what happened. So I think if we think maybe of a timeline, and it's 1,000 years here, maybe even further, and then we come to white settlers. And in the colonial period, the definition of voting, and if you could help me with this, Julie, was really based on property and the ownership of property. And so in some cases in the colonies, when women owned property, they voted. And
well, we had that in New York with the Property Act of 1848 for the married women.
Yes, that was in New York. Actually, the earliest one was in Mississippi, and it was based on native law. A native woman took a case to court where she was demanding her property, and Mississippi said, based on, I think it was, would it have been Choctaw law, that married women could own their own property. And so they established that in Mississippi. But so there were women that were voting, and the suffragists, some of them said, we're not asking for a new right. We're asking for the restitution of a right that our foremothers had. So colonial period, and they know this is going on. Then we come to the 1830s and the formation of the female anti-slavery societies. The very first one was African American women forming in Salem, Massachusetts. And by 1837, they formed a national organization. It is African American and white women working together. And not only are they working for an end to slavery, this blows my mind. This is a time period when I always assumed that women couldn't talk about anything that was, unseemly related to sex. They're calling out the institutional rape of enslaved women. The female anti-slavery societies in the 1830s are doing this. Now, this is where the women are learning, African American and white, are learning to organize. They're learning political strategies. They're developing their political voice in these anti-slavery movements. 1848 is typically, okay, I'm going to commit another heresy here. I hope I commit at least 10 today, okay? Count them, please, if you would. One of them is 1848 in Seneca Falls. That's, ta-da, the moment that we say
Go ahead, do it.
We begin, right? Well, maybe we should put it back to 1837, but I also, 1848 was a local convention, and I am waiting for the moment when a fourth grader who is doing her women's history project discovers, going through her local papers, that, wow, there was a women's rights meeting here in 1846. These historical moments are ones that we can keep pushing back. But we do know that by 1850, the first national Women's Rights Convention was held. The 1850s are a time period in which almost every single issue that we're still dealing with today was raised. Equal pay for equal work was just a given as something that had to be won in the 1850s, and even before in some cases. A woman's right to her own body was an issue that was raised then. It was violence against women. They boom, come out of the chute, and they're raising all of the issues. 1860, the war starts, and women say, well, the other thing that's going on during this time period is that the American Equal Rights Society is formed, and every women's rights convention They timed them to meet at the same time that the American Anti-Slavery Convention is meeting. And you scratch a suffragist and you find an abolitionist. You scratch an abolitionist and you find a suffragist. And I'm talking African American women and men, white women and men, and their work is almost inseparable. They're both doing the same thing. Okay? 1862, the war starts, and the women say, we're going to suspend our work and we're going to support the war effort, but not under the conditions that Lincoln is saying. Lincoln at this point is saying that the war is being fought to preserve the Union. They gather 400,000 signatures, the largest number of signatures that has ever been gathered on United States soil to this point. And they say, we will only support this war effort as long as it is being fought to end slavery. The end of the war, the American Equal Rights Society and the women's rights meetings that have begun again, they come together and they form the American Equal Rights Society. Anti-slavery, women's rights, working together with a common goal, a single goal, universal suffrage.
Quick question. Is that where the parentheses in the Emancipation Proclamation says in warring states comes from because of that technicality? With Lincoln and the freeing of the slaves, because it was really a document for the North because, like you say, he's preserving the Union. But when you look, it says in warring states that they're thenceforward and forever free. In warring states. So if you're not a warring state and you had a slave, you were good.
Yeah. You could probably speak to that better, but it limits it to where it's unenforceable.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
these are the loopholes that have carried through in the law
that's a good point.
You know, we really sort of, it's like having the walls of prison and you get out of prison, but you depend on those walls after a while to sort of preserve you. But I want to come back to the whole point that you were making about the race and class system. Because I think that I want to take advantage of the diversity we have here and also in the room. And I know that Brian is going to give me a signal when it's time to do some audience Q&A, so we don't get too far ahead of ourselves. But anyway, if we can just sort of bridge in sort of this timeline with the whole things, because the New York Times has been specifically vehement. There are several writers about the loss of the voice of the Black women's in this whole suffrage movement, even to the point of saying there are 22 significant suffragists, and of which 7 were African American. Nameless and faceless still in the New York Times because they did not enumerate these 7 women.
Can I call out some of them?
Please do.
And then I also would really like to talk about what happens. Here's this incredible coalition between African Americans and whites, and what happens to it. But I'm just going to call out a few names. The entire Purvis family, the Fortin family, the Rollins sisters in South Carolina, who are the political operatives. These are families of people. Charles and Sarah Ramond. Well, of course, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. I mean, we could just Sojourner Truth. You know, we just go on and on and on. But the unsung, here's one: Marianne Shadd Cary and her sister Amelia. Marianne Shadd Cary was the first African-American woman to publish a weekly newspaper in the North American hemisphere. She goes on to, when the war starts, she comes back from Canada, where she's publishing her newspaper. She comes back and becomes a military recruiter, recruiting African-American soldiers. She goes on to law school. She becomes an attorney, and she is a strong operative in the National Woman Suffrage Association. One single woman. We could spend a
why
day
does
or
history
two
forget
talking
these
about
people? I mean, that's very significant what you said.
Yeah.
And yet, I'm sure everybody in this room has been to school and we've never heard of this woman.
Well, this is the painful part of the story. 1890, there are two different women's rights organizations that form in 1870. In 1869. 1870s, they're working separately. American works for the vote state by state. Well, think about the implication of this. This is a time when the southern states are working to stop African American men from voting. If I say, please give me the right to vote, doesn't that also say you can take the vote away from black men? Because when the nation is trying to figure out who gets to decide who votes, is it the states or the feds? This plays into states' rights, the American work. National says, nope, we're going for a federal amendment. 1890, the two groups merge. It is a messy, dirty political move. I dish the dirt in my book. And what happens after 1890, and this is the place of accountability that we must take before we can celebrate 2020, and that is that the National American Woman Suffrage Association practices racism as policy. They say, give women the right to vote, because white women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, and woman suffrage is a way to maintain white native-born supremacy. They use that language, white supremacy, and that becomes policy. They also allow the state auxiliaries, they're practicing state by state, give women the vote, and they allow their state societies who have autonomy to work for the vote for white women only, some of them do. They allow them to segregate, which some of them do, and they allow them to work for Jim Crow laws. Here's the painful admission. Part of the reason the Jim Crow laws had strength was because suffragists fought for them.
And it's important to mention with the National Women's Suffrage Association, this is a direct link back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony as the founders of that group.
Well, actually, the National American, when it merges, really takes on the Americans, their constitution, their states' rights focus, all of that is really, and the interesting thing is that while Anthony and Stanton they are absolutely racist in their statements during that 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment period, guess where the African Americans go? Do they go to the American or do they go to the National? They go with Stanton and Anthony.
And nothing changed over the course of the 200 years since. You know, it's very interesting in the racial and economic and so forth dynamic, because it's a caste and class system.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think this raises some very interesting questions about how we should remember the legacy of the 19th Amendment, because on the one hand, you could read in Sally's book some of the amazing and ahead of their time ways of thinking that you see in the suffragists of the 19th century, but really what enables the 19th Amendment to be ratified. And just a quick primer on constitutional amendments in the United States. We have notoriously one of the most difficult constitutions to amend under Article 5. You need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of all the states' legislatures to ratify. That's how hard it is to get an amendment, and I believe the last time we amended the Constitution was before I was old enough to vote, and I'm in my 40s. So because it's so notoriously hard, what it means is that you'll only get an amendment when there's sufficient consensus by people who have influence and people who vote. And what it means is that the 19th Amendment, part of its success is a success brought to you by a politics that we might actually think of today, looking back, as being against the original principles of the suffragists. But the reality of this country is that things that are politically successful tend to come with a politics shared with people with whom we might disagree. But we have to make coalitions with people with whom we vehemently disagree, sometimes people who hold pretty offensive views, in order to actually get an amendment or in order to get something that actually succeeds politically. And that's something I think that's very difficult about American politics and about constitutional change in this country.
You know, the one thing that I wonder about with that, though, is that there's a way in which historians have looked at an inevitability to, had to get the South, had to play to racism to get it. But I wonder if we might think about that question differently. What if they had chosen different allies? What if they had chosen to support the rights of African American men to vote? What if instead of fighting against immigrants, they had fought for immigrant rights and courted the immigrant men rather than alienating them? By the time the suffrage amendment was ratified, the Ku Klux Klan endorsed it. By the time it was ratified, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know if I would have supported it, because they had brought in the Women's Christian Temperance Union that wanted to put God in the Constitution, prayer in the public schools.
So I'm actually writing about the Women's Christian Temperance Union right now, and I think this is actually that's been written out of suffrage history in a way. And I think if you actually look closely at the documents, Frances Willard was actually a very interesting figure, and there are ways in which they were actually trying to draw in black women in the South, and it really turns and the temperance movement is actually one that is advocating for changes in married women's property laws, the liberation of women in the context of sexual assault, raising the age of consent so that you could actually prosecute people who sleep with 12-year-old girls, right? So they're advocating for a lot of the same things that the early suffragists are advocating for in the late 19th century. But there's also very complicated anti-immigrant and racist politics that develops later in the temperance movement.
Right.
Not the
policy of put God in the Constitution and Jesus Christ is the head of the government.
They never actually advocated that as a matter of
Well, I was also going to say, did we qualify what the temperance movement was? Did we explain that? Because I don't think everybody might be familiar with it. That's another class that was missed in the history lessons.
So the Women's Christian Temperance Union is formed in 1873 in a moment where there are crusades all around the country. And what's really interesting, and then they have a very charismatic president, Frances Willard, who takes over in 1879.
Matilda Joslyn Gage called her the most dangerous woman in America.
I feel
when the WCTU took the policy of placing God in the Constitution, destroying the wall of separation of church and state.
But they also very significantly advocated for home protection, which is, they said women needed the vote in order to protect their own status within the home, right? So they were actually advocating for things like women's equal guardianship over their children, advocating for raising the age of consent to sex, advocating for women's right to own their own earnings. These were all things that they thought, so it wasn't just we need the vote just to have the vote, but we need to change all the laws that make it actually a myth. It was said in a Supreme Court concurring opinion by a justice in a Supreme Court decision upholding the exclusion of women from the legal profession. A Supreme Court justice says that it's because women are their divine province is the home, right? And if you think about what the legal reality of women in the 19th century, women actually did not have dominion over the home. And the Christian Temperance Union thought that by focusing on alcohol regulation, prohibiting alcohol, and actually addressing the problem of drunk husbands either committing domestic violence or drinking away the family wage, thereby making it necessary for women to work and own their own earnings. That was the way in which they advocated for prohibition. There were parts of the Christian Temperance Union, of course, that were more interested in things that you're calling dangerous, and rightfully so. But so much of the movement in the 19th century was actually focused on positions that we would today describe as feminist. And that's a legacy of prohibition, which I think has been somewhat written out of the history. But many historians, there's a rich academic literature by historians in the mid to late 20th century that reconstruct that history.
One of the problems that it raised was that it really brought the anti-suffrage movement into its full strength because the liquor industry brought in tremendous amounts of money.
And that's why the 18th Amendment, it is prohibition.
Temperance before, yeah.
Right.
I think that
Get
the origin of
prohibition
all
before.
of this, though, is the doctrine of discovery. And that's the beginning of the bigger problem, right? That's what it's brought all of this to today. When they came here, Europeans came here under the guise of the doctrine of discovery, that they were going to subdue, vanquish, right, any non-Christian people. That included their women, right? I mean, whether they were Christian or not Christian, they owned them. There was an ownership in that. And that's what we're talking about. That's where, so if we want to fix it, you almost have to go all the way back to look at the very beginning. You know, how did that start and how did we get this far?
I think, America is built on a Judeo-Christian society, a Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think if we look all the way back to 1066 with William the Conqueror, when he put the Magna Carta together and, they put all of these rules and the state shall do this and the citizen shall do that and so forth. All of these things are really amazing and wonderful because there is no originality in this stuff. All of our laws, it all ebbs and flows from somewhere, the same way our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution ebbed and flowed from indigenous law. So, I would love for Betty to just enlighten us for a few minutes on that point.
Absolutely. I think it's so important. You brought up constitutional law. It wasn't written. We were an oral tradition. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make it any less substantial. Our founders, when our great law of peace came to us, we have laws and instructions of behavior and personal conduct, right, that follow us through. And something that you just said, too, that it was built on, what did you say?
Judeo-Christian.
Judeo-Christian, right, values. It was actually, it's born out of pure dominance, this doctrine of domination. It's born out of racism, right? And the term racism, you can look it up, it really means, it's like the absence of spirituality, right? It makes sense when you say it that way. But when you really look at it, and you break it down to that point, it was about how to control and dominate to their favor and all the way through up until now. And I think that's the difference. When you leave out everybody's voice, right? You can dominate, you can control, you can determine what somebody else is going to do, but that's what brought us to this place. So this administration right now is really, it's kind of, it was inevitable, the administration that we have now. The Trump administration was inevitable. If you're beginning from the doctrine of discovery, he's just an inevitable, right, product of that.
Can you say what the doctrine of discovery is?
Oh, sure.
Everybody knows.
So that was a papal bull given by St. Nicholas, and it basically gave the right to Christian countries to take over. If they were to come upon lands that were considered uninhabited by Christians, then they were what's called terra nullius, meaning void or empty lands. We had rich, cultures. We don't call them religions. This is a way of life. I don't go to church every Sunday. It's something that I practice every single day, which is completely different. It's completely intertwined, and it's deeply rooted in Mother Earth. And so this papal bull gave them the right, Europe, France, to come here and say, we're going to claim this land for our own. And this happened even on my nation. So the French Jesuits came with a proclamation that they were going to own 600 square miles of land. Can you imagine the audacity? I'm just going to roll up to the Queen of England and or to France and hand over and say, no, I own all of this area. And they were going to do it regardless. And that meant killing, raping, burning villages. And they know that the heart of our community is our women, because we have such a strong presence, and that if you really destroy the women, you're going to destroy that community. And that's what happened throughout North America and South America, Central America, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, all of these countries, it's all based on that one doctrine. And to get the Catholic Church to repudiate it, because you don't want it to just rescind it. You want it repudiated, because to repudiate it would mean that that has legal implications.
And it still has effect today.
It still has effect today. It's still used as recently as 2005 in the United States and 2011 in Canada. And I can't even imagine, my sister from Australia is not here right now, but I'm sure she could tell you how it affects her communities as well. But, so I'm fortunate. I always say that I'm grateful and fortunate for where I come from.
Well, Betty,
different.
the wonderful thing about what you just shared with us, this is the notion of power. And you see, when you have people and it's broken down by gender, by race, by class, you stumble on something that people who never had power could never access. So therefore, they never had a voice or a say-so, because frankly, they were like cattle. They were chattel, okay? And, a long time ago, we all learned in school about white man's burden. They had to come in and they had to teach the indigenous people because, about God and religion, because this was the savior method and mechanism by which to control. The slaves were never taught to read, because that, again, is power. So once you really understand, racism and other things we can't control are constants. So it doesn't make sense to cry and weep about stuff that you have no control over, because by virtue of our DNA all being different, we look different, we are different, we have different habits and attitudes. It's never going to be one kumbaya chorus, as they say. But what we need to do is learn how to respect and tolerate and celebrate our differences. Because here is another element of power that, if we really could figure it out, we might have a new playbook. And that's where I would really like to sort of sum up our discussion. I want to thank Dr. Roesch Wagner for this amazing book, The Women's Suffrage Movement, which you will all be able to get your own glance at. And it was really a wonderful read of the many different who's asking and who's telling stories. So I want to thank her for this is a life work, really, that's summed up on these pages. And I want to thank her for being with us today. I want to thank Betty for sharing with us how all of the wonderful stories and the indigenous way. And I want to thank Julie for bringing the Constitution to the party. So on that note, I'd like to turn to the audience and see if we have any questions that we can field. Brian will just take the mic and just see who has a question. Gentleman, right here.
My question was, you mentioned, Julie, something about the 19th Amendment, that there was some challenge to its legality. Could you explain that or talk a little bit about that?
So there was some litigation in around 19...
Is it on? Okay. Go ahead.
in around 1920. And it was argued that the 19th Amendment was not a valid amendment because you couldn't actually have a federal amendment that would change voting, which really belonged to the states, right? And it wasn't really based on any textual provision. So in modern constitutional law parlance, I think this was a way, the challengers would say this is an unconstitutional constitutional amendment, if that concept makes any sense. There are some constitutions today that have certain unamendable provisions. So the German Basic Law says that the provision guaranteeing the protection of human dignity is unamendable, which means if you wanted to say there's no longer human dignity, you'd have to have a revolution and write a new constitution because you can't amend it within the terms of that constitution. So there was an argument that was made and that was not successful in 1920 that if you tried to give a federal right to vote, right? Because remember, back in those days, they really thought about states as being the source of citizenship. Until you had the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, you didn't have an idea of federal, the idea that the federal government could give any one state citizenship, right? And so similarly here, it's being argued that if a federal constitutional provision says that you can't deny the right to vote on account of sex, that actually violates something that we fundamentally understand to belong to the states, and because the federal system and we also have a constitutional provision that preserves powers not mentioned in the Constitution to the states, the 10th Amendment, that having a federal amendment that suddenly gives women the right to vote is just an unconstitutional constitutional amendment. It's an argument that fails, but it's attempted.
The young lady right here.
Oh, you had mentioned we need a new playbook. Well, that was pretty much here when Europeans came to this country. And it's not so much a playbook as it is a cultural reorientation to the earth. And when people arrived, the Haudenosaunee actually convened with the founding fathers of this country to create a new form of democracy. And we are from central New York. I grew up 2 miles north of the Onondaga Nation. I am a Mohawk citizen at Akwesasne. And my husband directed a repurposing of a Jesuit fort that was at Onondaga Sacred Lake. And this is where the Confederacy was formed, the place, the sacred place where these 5 nations came together. And we've worked diligently to pull together all the educational institutions in the area to tell this story. And we arrived to the name for this place. We call it Scano, the Great Law of Peace Center. And the very first thing you learn when you come into the center is what Scano, Nyawenha Scano means. And it means we are thankful that you are well and to be at peace. And for you to become peaceful, you can only do that through your proper relationship with the natural world. And that's why women were so powerful at this encounter, because they understood that proper place that's in balance. They distribute the clan. They connect each child that's born to the earth. And it's not that we're all different racially. That has really nothing to do with it, because as varied we are in race, the earth is multi-faceted. So we have to listen to the earth. It's ever-changing moment by moment, and what it provides us are the gifts to sustain our lives as human beings.
Thank you for that. Please give my regards to Chief Porter.
Oh, yes.
The young lady in the back.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to enlarge a little bit about what you said on the doctrine of discovery. I think what the basic issue here would be that we're talking about the church ruling over this, somehow gets itself involved in ruling in this country. And what Sally said about keeping God out of the Constitution, I mean, it's the most important thing. You had said, why didn't we learn about such and such in history? Okay, well, that is the most. Unfortunately, I mean, the people in charge, say, of this country have left out of history the things they don't want you to know. And that's why we keep coming up with all kind of discoveries, and mostly can find them in local newspapers and things like that. It takes 1 or 2 generations for events to be lost from memory if they're not coming down to us in written form. And one of the things I think that's the most important thing that in Sally's professional life is the unearthing, say, of the writings of a woman named Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was best friends with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she said, and that's why she disappeared from history, that religion is the greatest oppressor of women. And I mean, you see how it props up every so often among a conservative people, right? And in order to deprive women of certain rights, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very radical. I mean, a radical idea. How are you gonna keep the church out of our political business? But there you have it.
But it's not necessarily about keeping the church out. It's about boundaries, frankly. And I think that as we grow older as a nation and working together, as we understand peoples and cultures, and as we work on an inclusion and an intersectional mentality in how we do business and how we set policies, I think that it is important that there's a place for the church. I mean, the whole reason for the Seneca Falls Convention, one of the main ones, was because the women in church could not read a Bible passage. All the reading was done by the men. You know, you look back in history, and Dr. Wagner can give you chapter and verse. It seemed like the Society of Friends were the most progressive, the Quakers, because they allowed women to read in the church or the worship setting, as you would say, because they didn't really have church as, you know, the Christian society deems church. So I think that I'm glad for your point about Matilda Jocelyn Cage, because organized religion is something else, but we don't want to go into that at this point. I'd like more questions about suffrage if we can, while we have Sally here. Young lady over here.
Hi, I'm Julie Walsh. Thanks so much. I read Sisters in Spirit and wanted to ask a little bit about that book and the new book. If a lot of that information is in the new book, if there's new information about the Haudenosaunee and the Onondaga women's influence on the early suffragettes, and if there was anything. I wanted to ask you what was the kind of most interesting story that you have learned over the years, this book or before, about those early suffragettes' direct encounters with the Onondaga. Thanks.
The book that you so kindly referenced, Sisters in Spirit, the Haudenosaunee Influence on Women's Rights, looks at the sort of general picture of, but it doesn't include the original writings, just snippets of. This book begins with the writings of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and Alice Fletcher about how clearly they're influenced by Native women. So it's the Haudenosaunee, but it's also, they're looking internationally at Indigenous women and their influence. And it's some pretty impressive scholarship for the time that they, one tiny piece, if I might just answer that. Lucretia Mott spent, before she came to Waterloo, and she and 5 of her Quaker friends and Elizabeth Cady Stanton planned the Seneca Falls Convention. She had been spending time, I think about a month, at Cattaraugus, which is a Seneca community. And she, in the one account that I've been able to find, the only written record of that summer by Lucretia Mott was a letter that she published in the Liberator, the anti-slavery paper, and it's like and it's in the book, and it's 3 or 4 paragraphs about the Haudenosaunee spending time with the Seneca, and you know, it's this wonder at you know how they live their lives. There's a small paragraph about Seneca Falls and the convention. So I don't know if that's, you know, her. She also spent time that summer with the freedom community in the fugitive slaves, the freedom takers that had gone to Canada where they could have freedom after the Fugitive Slave Act. This actually was before, but there already was a good community that had gone to the greater freedom in Canada. So she writes a little bit about that, but mostly it's about the Seneca.
I just want to clarify for some people, because we heard at two different points in the audience about the Haudenosaunee and also from Betty before. It's the same thing as saying Iroquois Nation and Federation. There's 6 tribes coming together that consists of the Iroquois Nation.
Yes, the word Iroquois was a derogatory term given to us, but we're not Iroquois, we're Haudenosaunee. That's our own word for each other, so if that helps to clarify it. And I just want to say that women's rights are inherent, as is Mother Earth's, right? We have the right and responsibility to protect her and all living beings, or we will cease to exist. And then how can women's rights, right now, even within the U.S., I'm thinking of like the U.S. and not the Haudenosaunee, but how can they propel that